Gungrave is the brainchild of mangaka Yasuhiro Naitao, the creator of Trigun, and Studio Red Entertainment, the makers of some games I would like to cover on the channel at some point, like Bujingai and Blood Will Tell. A year after its release, it was adapted into a 26-episode anime by Studio Madhouse, the same people behind the Trigun anime. Naitao's style bleeds from this game. Just looking at it, you can see that this was made by the dude who drew Trigun. It has a lot of the iconography from Trigun that I love, from boxy and angular weapons to tattered jackets and trench coats flowing in the wind, and turning the environments into Swiss cheese from hurricanes of gunfire. This is probably the closest thing we'll get to a Trigun video game since the one that Red Entertainment was also making got cancelled, and the only piece of public footage of the game is this trailer from 2002 at Sega's Game Jam. God, I really would have liked to play that game, it probably would have been pretty cool! In an interview with the game's producer, Toru Kubo, he talked about how the game was inspired by a multitude of things like Robert Rodriguez's Desperado and John Woo films. Something that all of these pieces of media have in common is the destruction of their locations, scenes filled with insert shots of their locales being absolutely annihilated by gunfire. Gungrave converts that into gameplay perfectly with its destructible environments and the fact that your combo meter is kept up and increased by destroying everything in your wake. I love this game's visuals. It's a perfect blend of a few different styles without any kind of aesthetic clashing. From its 3D cutscenes both in-engine and pre-rendered, to the load screens which are probably just concept art but it looks like manga panels, and the end of mission title cards when you receive your score, which some look like they are hand-drawn, but I could be wrong and they were just made in engine. The cutscenes have this stiffness to its animation that I don't know how to put into words, but I find it very appealing. They remind me of what Guilty Gear would eventually adopt for its story mode in Exart and Strive. Our basic premise before we get more in depth with the story later in the video is you play as Beyond the Grave, or Grave for short, and you are an undead man hell-bent on taking down the Syndicate and their new leader, Harry McDowell. Gungrave is one of those games where the story is window dressing to push gameplay forward, but for what is there, it's really enjoyable and serves to further build on the game's stellar vibes. Gungrave is also one of those read the manual type games, where if you want to know what anything is and or means, you have to read it. The one time I cheaped out and not going complete in box. Thankfully, you can find scans for the manual very easily. I'll link to one in the description below. And the game is simple enough and understandable enough that I was able to play through it with no problem without having read it. Gungrave is a corridor third-person shooter with hallways open and wide enough to create shooting galleries in all meaning of the word. In most third-person shooters of the era, you would be moving around while fighting or shooting from cover. Gungrave has more in common with one of those cowboy shootout games you'd see at carnivals. Enemies fly out of the woodwork and line up to try to stop you, only for you to send them flying. You can move while shooting, but you can't sprint while doing it, and movement while shooting is pretty slow. Your name is Beyond the Grave, and your movement reflects that in a very literal sense. You shamble around like a walking corpse. Combine this with your shield that regens when not being hit, and just how many hits it can take before breaking, dealing damage to your real health bar, the game really incentivizes you to stand your ground and just start blasting. The end of mission rating also scores you more if you are stylish while taking down enemies, and like I mentioned earlier, your combos build from doing damage to the environment. So just play the game like you're in the opening of DMC3 with Dante riding that demon. Your combat options are on the basic side with only a pair of pistols, your coffin as a melee weapon, and demolition shots, which were originally called Desperado shots earlier in development in reference of the Robert Rodriguez film I mentioned earlier. These consume 1 ammo each time you use them and can be refilled by getting enough hits in a combo to replenish the skull meter on the left side of your screen. You only start with the rocket launcher for the first few levels, which is another reference to Desperado, and you get 3 more over the course of the game, but I'm not really sure when, since I suddenly realized I had access to them at the end of the game, but I'd imagine I got a new one each time I beat a boss. Each boss also has a special demolition shot to finish them off when their health is low and the skull on your HUD is glowing blue. I sure hope you don't have carpal tunnel syndrome, because this is a game where your wrists go to die. You're going to be very familiar with mashing that square button because that is all you do for this entire game. For movement options, your best bet is to mix between being stationary doing sick gun katas and also using the 4-way directional dodge. Sadly, the game doesn't really have any moments where you can dive backward down a flight of stairs while firing into a group of enemies, but that didn't stop me from trying to orchestrate a scenario of that anyways. The biggest thing to wrap your brain around with the controls is when moving Grave with the left stick, it is also used to move your camera around. At times, it can be pretty awkward to try to move the camera if dudes are flanking you, since you can only do a 180-degree turn by pressing L2. So there are a few blind spots where enemies can be caught in that would be more manageable if your camera had a slightly faster turn speed. For level design, the game rarely ever evolves past the big open corridors for shooting galleries I mentioned earlier, and when it does, it's often for the worst. The awkward camera controls do not make for good navigation of tight hallways, and where the camera is placed smack dab in the middle of the screen, and how at times it awkwardly orbits Grave since he and the camera have to move together, places like the sewer level feel far too claustrophobic to try to see and combat enemies. It's at its worst when you have to round doorways and enemies are on each side of it. Your movement is just too stiff to not get hit, which is probably why you are so tanky. I do want to bring up that the game is very short. It only took me about 2 hours to get through the whole thing, and a good 30 to 45 minutes was stuck on 2 of the final bosses. Its short length felt perfect and honestly played towards the game's favor. The length of each stage combined with how simple yet satisfying the combat is, accompanied by this banging soundtrack, always left me feeling full after completing a level. It's like eating a meal that you think going in will leave you hungry, but after finishing it, you realize how oddly filling it was and are left satisfied. That's how I felt when I kept going back for footage for certain stages. Every time I hit that score screen, I was just like, ah, that was good. It feels very reminiscent of playing an old arcade game. And if it wasn't already obvious enough from the footage I've shown up until now of this game, it's pretty easy, but it does take a noticeable spike in difficulty for the second and third bosses from the end. Bear Walkins' second form seems to only be hit from this tiny spot where his real body actually is, and all of his attacks are massive, and you are kept at a range where your pistol can't really reach him without running the risk of getting hit by one of his attacks. This boss would be a lot easier if you were far more nimble instead of having the movement of a walking corpse, which, you know, is apt. The Bunji fight is also noticeably harder than all of the others. I seriously felt like I was missing something about this boss fight. I always struggle when he hides behind one of these massive pillars and starts regenning his entire health bar, and when I round the corner to stop him, he just sends me flying and I can't even see what he hits me with due to the camera. The only time I've been able to avoid this is going around the pillar far enough out that I could see him in my peripheral vision, but when doing this, by the time I get into position, he's most likely healed up almost his entire health bar. This is still a sick rival fight regardless, and people in the comments will most likely tell me that I'm missing some facet of this boss that makes it far easier and far more enjoyable. Now, from here on out, I'm going to be talking about the end of the game and the rest of its story, so if you want to go in blind and play the game for yourself and watch the anime, click here to avoid spoilers. Before the start of the final level after beating Bunji, we get a cutscene that explains everything that has happened leading up to this very moment. Grave's name was originally Brandon, and like mentioned earlier in the game, he used to be a part of the Syndicate before becoming the undead killing machine he is now. The world of Gungrave was cruel and unkind to our cast of characters, and the previous leader of the Syndicate, Big Daddy, wanted to create a world of peace for his daughter and everyone else, and tasked you with helping making that dream a reality. Then, in an elevator later, Harry pitches to you a plot to help him kill the boss, and with the new thing he's got his hands on, you'll both be able to control the entire city. Since you are clearly not on board with Harry's plan, he betrays you by shooting you in the stomach and then in the head, sending you falling down to the streets. Up until the final level of the game, the locations have been fairly grounded. There are still your fantastical elements like Grave himself and the monstrous forms the leaders of the Syndicate take, but the final level is the biggest departure from the standard street locations you've had up until now. Grave rides up an elevator, assumingly the one Harry killed him in, to the tower you've been fighting your way through the entire Syndicate's army to reach, and at the top you are above the clouds. It's like reaching an unnaturally made heaven. The enemies you fight here look like failed experiments of angels being birthed out of these massive floating heart-like cocoons that pulsate like a heartbeat, and the music accompanying this level is perfectly unsettling. with futuristic stairs that form out of thin air floating on nothing. It's like reaching ending D of Drakengard, and it's absolutely perfect. You confront Harry, and the final boss is Big Daddy, which Harry has turned into a giant blue baby monster hooked up to machinery. And then in phase 2, you must fight this gigantic head running down a path that looks like a spine inside of a ribcage. It's absolutely nightmarish, and I love when games completely shift like this in their final act. After you beat your former boss, the game ends on one of my favorite video game gimmicks, where you have to press square to fire the bullet that kills Harry.
終わったか。やれよブランドン。今度はお前の番だ。さあ。
Gungrave is short, sweet, and the exact type of game when I think about AA middle-of-the-shelf games from the PlayStation 2 era that is sorely missing in today's market. The story of this game is that perfect middle ground where there's enough left up to your imagination to fill in the blanks, but there is also enough present to tell a simple yet effective story to push the gameplay forward, and can easily be expounded upon in future entries. Copies have gotten pretty pricey on eBay recently, going for around $40 or more, so you're probably better off emulating it since there isn't any way to get the game officially off the PSN store, and you'll get around some of the instances of slowdown when there are too many enemies on screen. After getting mixed reviews only sitting at 65 on Metacritic, a sequel would be released 2 years later under the name of Gungrave Overdose. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching as always. If you really liked the video, please leave a like, comment, and pass it around. And if you really like the channel, maybe consider becoming a patron on Patreon. All patrons get access to videos a day early, along with a new $7 tier that gives you behind-the-scenes footage and incomplete rough cuts of upcoming videos. And I'm now going to thank my $5 and up patrons who really help support the channel. Bully, Akita Fishkiyama, Lucy the Fox, Bluntman4200, Elliot Morton, Lotto, Nathan Redding, Papaya-chan, Slemp Tingle, Ben Johnson, Chichometrius, Dusty the Zombie, Ek Frazo, Filthyfinger69, Fishkami, Joshua DiLarino, Justin Collini, Kevin Velasquez, Nicholas Pedinato, Onion Girl, Poke Joke S, Quartz, Ruben Rodriguez, Star Fox, Some Panda, the FOE3, The Unthinkable, and William Moore. Thanks so much, guys. As for what's coming next, I do want to get the Overdose video out in hopefully a week or two's time. I already started playing it at the time of recording this outro, and I've already got a lot more to say about that game than this one. So hopefully it won't be too long and won't take too long to make. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, I've had some real life obligation stuff that gets in the way, so it's kind of hard right now to make some long form videos, which is why the Yakuza 2 retrospective and the Drakengard 1 retrospective, despite just saying I was going to focus on them, have to be put on the back burner, and I don't really know when I'll have the time to make them. So for the time being, I'm probably going to be sticking to smaller, shorter videos on either new releases or some old backlog stuff or some PlayStation 2 classics I've really wanted to cover for a while. Either way, whatever comes out next, I hope you enjoy, and as always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.